In January, Jody Wilson-Raybould was, I guess, some would say, demoted from her role as Minister of Justice and Attorney General to Veterans Minister. But I'm wondering, what is the duty of the Attorney General? I mean, do you owe that duty to the people of Canada first, or is it's to your client first, i.e. the Prime Minister or the PMO's office?
So the challenge is that the short answer is it's both. And the question is, how does one deal with that interplay? I mean, there's no doubt that as a lawyer, you have a very clearly defined and circumscribed responsibility to your client. However, as the lawyer, the Attorney General, so the most senior lawyer in the federal government for all of Canada, you do have a public interest requirement, and there is some question about whether that public interest requirement gives you the permission to do something that you otherwise might not be able to do. Now, I think that's a very difficult line to clearly define, and certainly if I were advising Jody Wilson-Raybould, I'd want to be very, very careful before I said, don't worry about it, you've got a public interest exception, just say what you think you need to say on behalf of the people of Canada, because it's obviously a much more nebulous and fuzzy public interest than it is the very clearly defined box that one has with respect to solicitor-client privilege. So it's just one more of those complicated legal questions that really only arise in a circumstance like this. You know, a lawyer to client in a private situation, there would almost never be a public interest scenario that might come up. I mean, we talk about it in law school situations where your client tells you, I'm about to go and commit a violent offense. Then you can breach solicitor-client privilege because you've got a broader responsibility to ensure that somebody doesn't get harmed by your client. But even then, it's complex.
Aren't attorney generals privy to conversations such as the one that the Prime Minister had alluded to that happened in the fall, or discussions like that?
Well, yes, they are privy to it.
Who do
they get to talk about it with, right? And I think one of the questions also that's being asked is, what's the significance of resigning from cabinet? Because, of course, the initial approach, there had been a demotion, or she was fired, or she sort of stepped aside, whatever you want to call the move from Attorney General to Veterans Affairs, depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on there. But there's no doubt that she then makes the decision, interestingly, right after Justin Trudeau says the fact that she's in cabinet, quote unquote, speaks for itself. And then about 12 hours later, it spoke for itself when she decides to exit cabinet. Well, does that open doors for her? Does that give her any opportunity where she can say, I'm no longer a cabinet minister, so I can say things that perhaps I couldn't say before? I've seen some suggestion from some lawyers that changes the dynamic a bit. I'm very hesitant to advise a client in that regard, because when it comes to traditional solicitor-client privilege, it doesn't matter that the client is no longer your client. You can fire a client or be fired by a client. You can quit the practice of law. If I tomorrow decide I'm going to go and pump gas at the local station, relax a little bit, don't want to continue my practice, that does not give me permission now to violate all of the various secrets that clients have told me in the 20 years that I've been in practice. So I don't know that her leaving the cabinet means that she's now in a position to say, all right, fair game, I can talk however I want.
Where does this leave SNC-Lavalin? I mean, they have their own, I guess, criminal proceedings going on. They're embroiled in this political controversy. What are they being instructed to do? And should they have weighed in on this with some kind of a statement?
It leaves them in an incredibly awkward, incredibly uncomfortable situation, probably in part of their own making, considering the number of times that they lobbied the Liberal government for exactly the kind of legislation that they're now seeking to utilize, basically. And we've heard the new Attorney General, Mr. Lametti, say, bizarrely, and that's still on the table. That there's still a possibility of this remediation, this deferred prosecution agreement. So SNC is walking an incredibly narrow tightrope, trying to figure out how they can continue to sort of remain on the good side of a government that they very much hope will intervene in some way, will come to the decision that says you guys can take advantage of this deferred prosecution agreement, while at the same time manage the public relations disaster that is being involved in a criminal trial with respect to bribery and being at the center of what is now attacking the highest levels of government in the country. So, you know, I'm sure there's an army of lawyers trying to answer these questions, but those lawyers are also being heckled or jabbed, however you want to put it, by the various PR folks within SNC-Lavalin, and probably a lot of external crisis managers too. So there's plenty of people making money from SNC off of this.
What's the strategy going forward? This is an election year.
Strategy for whom, I guess, is also the question. I think we have a pretty good idea of what Jody Wilson-Raybould's strategy is. She's hired big-time counsel. She wants to be able to talk, whether that's to the Justice Committee, whether that's to people in Parliament, whether that's to the media, but she wants to be able to talk. So she's working on that strategy, and that might result in a court application for her to actually get a judge, not just the judge who is her lawyer, but an actual sitting judge to say, all right, I've looked at all of the issues here. Here's what you can and can't say. say. If she has that, she'll feel very confident with following whatever the guidelines are of a court. If you're the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office, you got to make a decision, because the longer this goes on, I think the more politically harmful it becomes, even if legally speaking things don't change. So you've got to make a decision about whose privilege do you think this is, and what's the cost-benefit analysis of trying to continue to assert that privilege. If you claim that you're only doing this in order to protect SNC-Lavalin, it might be a time for SNC-Lavalin to step in and say, you know what, it's our privilege, and we want to step up and assert that. We haven't heard that up until this point. So there are a lot of legal considerations, but as is often the case when you're the Prime Minister, political considerations trump the legal. And so while there's a lot of lawyers, I'm sure, around the Prime Minister's office, I don't know if it's the lawyers' voices who are being heard the loudest.